take it.
The title of today's presentation is Project Pegasus and the Advent of Time Travel. As many of you know, I've been waging a truth campaign now for almost 10 years, informing the people of the United States and the world that the United States crossed the threshold into practical time travel through multiple forms of time travel technology by 1970. And the advent of time travel occurred in a specific historical context, which is work that was being done by the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency beginning in the mid-1960s and continuing through the mid-1970s. So I'm trying to both present what happened in the derivation of time travel and also sort of diffuse a lot of the conspiracy theories and urban legends that have developed around the subject of time travel, because it was in fact DARPA's Project Pegasus that pioneered time travel, and then many cover stories were propagated, including the Philadelphia experiment cover story. I can distinguish that later in my lecture. So, and I also want to stress that both during today's lecture about Project Pegasus and my lecture tomorrow about the CIA's Mars Jump Room program, I am sharing direct personal experience and nothing but it. So one of the things I'm trying to do is just stick to what I experienced. And if I end up, as I imagine I will, answering some questions, I'm going to tell you what I know from direct experience, what I can speculate about based on my direct experience and other claims that have been made, and then I'll tell you when I don't know something, because I really think that in parapolitics, the paranormal and parascience, we have to do that to be credible. I mean, I'm sharing information that leading physicists consider heretical, but in fact I was working with some of the world's leading physicists, indeed the Manhattan Project physicists, on Project Pegasus. So that's the nature of my campaign, the truth campaign that I'm waging. I'm sticking with what I know, I'm distinguishing what I think may be the case or not the case, and then I'm simply saying when I don't know something, because I think we have to adhere to that standard of informational integrity in the information wars that are going on around subjects like time travel. Is there a human presence on Mars? Is Mars inhabited? And so forth. So, Hesper, if I could have the next slide. As I mentioned, tomorrow's presentation is going to be on the Mars project and U.S. time travel history. I'm sharing information about my involvement in 2 secret defense projects, one in childhood in the 1970s, and one during the 4 years where I was an undergraduate at UCLA in the early 1980s. So this is tomorrow's presentation, the Mars project in U.S. time travel history. And if I could have the next slide. I initially sort of jumped into the U.S. time-space program in, we believe it was winter of 1968. What happened is my father, who was a special projects engineer for the Ralph M. Parsons Company, one of the world's leading process engineering companies and one of the United States leading defense contractors, told me that we were going to go out and get in the Volkswagen, and he yelled to my mom as we were leaving the house. He said, "Hon, I'm taking Andy to the hardware store," which from our home in Morris Plains, New Jersey, north central New Jersey, meant our only hardware store in Morris County, which was up in Florham Park. Instead, he drove me up to the Curtiss-Wright Aeronautical Company facility in Wood Ridge, New Jersey. And that was a facility that had built many of our Allied airplanes during World War II. It was a sprawling blacktop with multiple numbered buildings. So I said, "Dad, you're not taking me to the hardware store?" He said, "No, we're going to be going up here to Curtiss-Wright, and I'm going to be taking you somewhere else." And so we went through the parking lot and a security kiosk, and he was cleared. Now, my dad had been a private first class as a combat medic and ambulance driver in France and Germany during the war. But he was a major, a U.S. Army major in what was called the Second Reserve. When we were growing up, the U.S. military had a sort of a fifth column of ordinary citizens, doctors, lawyers, high school principals, engineers, architects, clergy, scientists, public officials, who were expected to step up and become our frontline political and military leadership if the number one security threat that the U.S. government was worried about happened, which, believe it or not, during the Cold War, was a land invasion of the continental United States by the Soviet Army delivered by the Soviet Navy, both of which were at least as large as our own forces. So my dad held the rank of major in the 2nd Reserve. So one time, for example, when he took me to Camp Kilmer in New Brunswick, New Jersey, I witnessed the guard look at his credentials and step back and salute him and say, "Thank you, Major, you may proceed." And I said, "Dad, you were a private in the war. What's this all about?" And he showed me his credentials, which featured his picture and the name of somebody named something like Henry Przybski. And I said, "Who is Henry Przybski?" And he said he was a friend of mine in Summit Hill. My dad had been born and grew up in a small Polish immigrant coal mining town in eastern Pennsylvania called Summit Hill, Pennsylvania. And I said, "Well, why do you have this credential with another name on it?" And he explained his sort of membership or role in the 2nd Reserve. So he basically had access to these sensitive military and defense contractor locations all over the country simply by proffering his credentials as a major in the U.S. Army in the 2nd Reserve. And so he was cleared through the desk there at Curtis Wright. We went up to Building 68, and it was about the size of maybe a high school chemistry classroom, chem lab, San Luis Obispo High School. And in the front of the room were 2 gray parenthesis-shaped objects that looked sort of just like if you put your fingers up like this, sort of like, like closing parentheses. They were built into their bases, kind of like high-end stereo speakers. And they were about 8 feet high and about 10 feet apart on the floor of the lab there. And on the left boom, there was a technician sitting at a video console with a keyboard. And on the right side, the boom was plugged into a power outlet on the wall that was about the size of the power you would need to power a small-sized industrial piece of equipment, like an industrial lathe or drill press, about twice the size of, let's say, our power outlet and cord that's driving, the PowerPoint device here in this room. It was not a major amount of power that was required, but it was a little bit more than a normal household appliance. And my dad had the technician turn on the device, and what I saw was essentially energy that was radiating between the 2 booms of the device, like water falling in a public sculpture. And then my dad had me go up towards the device, and it looked like raster on a TV set. And there were little squiggles at 3-inch intervals coming out of portals of light, sort of light lime green portals of light. So there were these bluish-green squiggles that were swimming across the field of raster, kind of like tiny little tadpoles. And my dad explained that we were going to step back, and on the count of 3, he's going to hold my hand, and we were going to jump through that field of energy. We've now seen that dramatized without my permission on Fringe, where not Raymond Basiago, but Walter Bishop jumps through a teleporter very much like that, not with his son Andrew, but Andrew's brother in the New Testament, Peter Bishop, kind of a simplified version of Basiago, I think. And so we practiced it a couple times, and then on the 3rd try, we leapt through the field of energy, and we immediately found ourselves in a bluish-white tunnel of light, and moving forward at a very rapid rate of speed, but also in a way where you perceive that we weren't moving at all. And as my father had stated, we might get separated during the jump, and in fact, he was sort of sucked through the wall as the tunnel began to fragment or compartmentalize as we got to our destination. And as my dad had described, we would find ourselves on a hillside somewhere else in the United States, and that hillside ended up being the state capitol complex in Santa Fe, New Mexico. So if any of you have been there, there's a hodgepodge of buildings of different eras of construction, and there are sort of different locations and altitudes, elevations there in that greater state capitol complex. And I did what my dad told me not to do, which is I started looking for him as he was looking for me, and it took us about an hour to find each other. Now, from there, my dad got a federal vehicle from a state office there in the Santa Fe State Capitol grounds. I know, in addition to myself, I know many people who have had very strange experiences in New Mexico because it's essentially one big military reservation. I mean, you can go to an ice cream parlor north of Santa Fe, and the people working there won't come out for 15 minutes, and it may very well actually be a civilian structure of some kind or business of some kind hiding an access point to a deep underground military base. The whole state of New Mexico is warned with deep underground military bases, and the state functionaries are sort of de facto agents of the U.S. government. And so my dad got a federal car from state workers there. That was kind of odd. And we drove up to the Los Alamos National Labs. We went through the front gate, made a right, and made a left, and I verified that in those years that indeed was the office of Dr. Harold Agnew, one of the Manhattan Project physicists. At that time, he was the director of W Division, which was the weapons division for the labs. The hidden history of U.S. time travel is that teleportation was weaponized during World War II, and it and other time travel technologies have remained essentially secret, compartmentalized devices held by the U.S. Department of Defense. So Agnew was then the man who had, or the scientist who had ambit over the nuclear weapons program. And he said, he came in and greeted my father, and my father handed him a prospectus. And I later learned from my dad that prospectus, he'd actually taken the paperclip off it back at Curtiss-Wright, because paperclips are magnetic metal, so he threw that away on the table there at Curtiss-Wright. So he hands Dr. Agnew this sheaf of paper and multiple pages, and Agnew starts reading through it. And without looking up, he says to my father, how was your trip out here? And my dad said, fine, Harold, and fast. And he looked up and said to my dad, oh, did you take the teleporter? And my dad said, yep, and so did my number 3 son, Andrew. And then Harold looked up at me and smiled. As you can see, I was an exceptionally cute lad. And said, how old? And my father and I said 6. Now, I was born on September 18th of 1961. And so if we were there at Harold M. Agnew's office at the Los Alamos National Labs, often called LANL for short, then that meeting with Dr. Agnew, which followed my dad and I teleporting there, had to take place sometime between September of 1967 and September of 1968. When I've looked back and tried to get the fix on it, it seems to have been like into winter of 1968. That would have been the winter of my first grade year. This is my kindergarten picture. So I was roughly this age when I first teleported with my dad to New Mexico and back from an identical teleportation device that was located in a room with identical linoleum floor tile, the same paper Dixie cup and number 2 pencil over on the window at the Sandia National Labs. Now I think they did that because the use of that device as a teleportation device was accidentally discovered when they constructed a model of one of the drawings that was in Nikola Tesla's papers upon his death in 1943. And it just said Tesla energetic array, or energetic array in his original documents. And they didn't know at first that it was a teleportation device, a teleporter. And they set it up there in that room in Curtiss-Wright. And what I was told is that a technician walked through the energy field to retrieve a screwdriver on a workbench in the lab, and he suddenly disappeared, so that his supervisor thought he had been disintegrated by this Tesla device. 6 weeks or 6 months later, he shows up at the door of the facility, of that very lab, and his supervisor collapses, literally collapses, believing that he's come back from the dead, or grateful that he didn't die in the development of this Tesla device, the construction of this Tesla device. And then he told the tale of how he fell through a tunnel, apparently in the time-space continuum, and popped out in Africa, where he was virtually deified by the local tribe that he had teleported to, until he explained that, no, I'm just an ordinary human being. He tried to communicate to them that in a way in which they would take him to the national government, he would be able to get home, and he did. And it was either 6 weeks or 6 months. I think it was 6 weeks. Sean David Morton has told that story as if, I think he says that Maitreya teleported to Africa or something. He's kind of mystified it. But that's in fact the story we were told in our training. So they realized that this Tesla device, in Tesla's original papers, that had actually been seized by the War Department, kept in the National Archives under the Alien Property Act in '44, and then forwarded to Los Alamos when the Manhattan Project physicists began gathering there to build the atomic bomb. They thought, well, let's send Tesla's paperwork to the physicists in the world who can make the most sense of them. So ultimately they were sent to Los Alamos when the Los Alamos Scientific Laboratory was being started to build the atomic bomb, and that's where they remain to this day. So my experience with time travel goes back to that 1968 period when, as a 6-year-old, going to age 7 by September of 1968. Fall of 1969, I'm placed in a learning lab at my public elementary school, Mount View Road School in Morris Plains, New Jersey, and we began being trained with these speed learning machines called tachistoscopes, which had been designed by the Office of Naval Research and constructed at one of my father's former employers, the Thomas A. Edison Research Labs in West Orange, New Jersey. So fall of '69, I'm 7 going on age 8 by September 18th. During those first couple days of the learning lab in early October, they sit me down at a table there in the learning lab and have me sign a secrecy and loyalty agreement under Department of Defense letterhead. Why am I speaking out today? Notwithstanding that agreement, under American law, children lack the capacity to contract. So sitting me down and having me sign that agreement was basically a legal nullity. It meant nothing. It was just an exercise to convince the children in the program to shut up about what they would be learning. So I'm going forward on Project Pegasus publicly without any concern that I can be prosecuted, because I can't be. Because what I learned then occurred between age 8 or 7 and 11, between fall of '69 when I was officially enrolled and then the end of the summer of '72. So I have no moral compunction about speaking out. And as you'll see in my presentation today, I have a moral duty to speak out, because we're going to be needing, at least at a minimum, Tesla teleportation to save our global civilization. I mean, here in California, every time Caltrans builds a lane on a California freeway, it fills up with cars in 30 days. I mean, who of us wants to be living in cities around the world with 24-lane freeways? I just went back to my hometown in Morris Plains, New Jersey, and on Ridgedale Avenue, a highway that was basically one lane of divided traffic when we left in November of 1972, is now 8 lanes on each side of Ridgedale Avenue, one part of that. It's gone from a 2-lane divided road to a 16-lane freeway in 40 years. So we're already at the limits to growth in terms of transportation. And so in addition to wanting to sort of right the moral score or personal score by talking out publicly, I'm speaking out under what I believe is a moral duty to advocate for the adoption of teleportation, which is one of my principal goals that I'll have, or have already, but that I'll implement if I'm elected President of the United States, which I will be pursuing in 2016. So I think that, we're running out of options, and we're really going to have to take our technical infrastructure, our urban infrastructure, up to a new high level of sophistication, or we're going to have collapses in our major cities just by people being stuck in traffic. I mean, you can't go to work or school or the hospital or the grocery store. You can't take your kids to school if everything is stopped on your major traffic arterials. I mean, that's what's occurring now all over the United States. And that's one of the reasons I recently took a trip to, I had some film shoots, some TV shoots, but I made it my business to investigate Pennsylvania as I knew it, New Jersey as I knew it, San Luis Obispo as I knew it as a graduate student in planning here in the early 90s. It's happening all over the country. The country's basically shutting down time-wise because we've reached the limits of growth in transportation. So we're going to be needing to be implementing Tesla teleportation to correct that, even if it's a matter of just taking all of the trucks off our freeways and our 16-wheelers, if not teleporting human beings. We're going to have to be shipping our goods via teleportation, or we're going to have a major economic, social collapse in this country. So I once asked my dad, I found out when I was being trained on Project Pegasus, and then years later by Courtney Hunt of the CIA, that I was one of 140 gifted and talented American school children who were enrolled in Project Pegasus. Some of the time travel devices required the involvement of children, and I'll explain that later in my lecture. But that's from 2 sources many years removed that stated it was 14 groups of 10 children, and each of the groups was indicated by a color, and each team had a captain. I was in blue team, and I was the captain of blue team. So I not only received specialized training to time travel, but I got some leadership training about what to do in the event that there was some kind of incident in which somebody had to make a decision. One of the children had to make a decision for the kids on their team. And I'll describe an event like that happened in a teleportation mishap that we were involved in, where I actually pulled rank and as captain of blue team and got the kids home. Years after I was in Pegasus, almost 20 years later, shortly before my father's death in 1990, we had been talking about the program off and on from roughly 1986 to his death in January of 90. Maybe 3 major heart-to-hearts and then some offhanded discussion. And I said, Dad, was I the first child to teleport? Because you took me to that, you took me on that trip when I was really quite small, I remember. And he said, no, you were probably about the 20th or 25th. And I said, why? And he said, well, the first group were 3 Navy enlisted guys, and they jumped through. They were adult volunteers from the Navy, and they jumped through, and they asphyxiated and died because the tunnel was too long, and they ran out of oxygen. So the first was a mishap, not unlike the Philadelphia experiment story of men being fused in the deck, but it really wasn't that dramatic. They simply suffocated because they ran out of oxygen because my dad and his colleagues had set up a tunnel that was too long. They hadn't learned how to fine-tune the device yet. And then I said, well, okay, Navy enlisted, what about after that? And he said, well, the second group we used, you have to understand how we were sort of compromised during those years. What we were doing was, we were concerned that if we used American children, that some of our most sensitive secrets would ultimately get out, and we would be compromised as a country. And we were trying to, as you remember, we were trying to stay one step ahead of the Russians, because they were working in similar areas. So what we decided to do was kind of a moral compromise. We negotiated with the right-wing authoritarian governments in Latin America to take their street urchins, literally their orphans, off the streets of Mexico City and Maracaibo, Venezuela, and Santiago, Chile, and Buenos Aires, Argentina, and other Latin American countries. And we made this deal with their government that we would sort of soak up their population of orphans and street urchins who had literally nothing, who were literally begging on the streets, homeless, without parents, without regular food, regular shelter, education, health care, and so forth. And we would take them and use them in our defense technical projects, and if they survived, or survived after being injured, we would then adopt them into American households and give them everything that they would not get as orphans on the streets of Latin American cities. So clearly that was an abuse of human rights, but it was one where the U.S. government tried to qualify it to itself ethically by then saying, well, if the kids survive, then they'll get everything that our kids have. And many of them did. And I said, well, did the kids die or were they injured? He said, no. Every one of them was adopted into an American household, by ultimately being exposed to what I was then exposed to when my dad took me on my first teleportation to meet with Dr. Agnew. So that's the hidden history of the involvement of children in teleportation. The first time travel heroes were Latin American orphans, maybe a few years older than myself, maybe born in the 1950s, late 1950s, 1960. And I always mention that not only because it was a serious moral compromise, because it's the truth of what the U.S. government was doing at that time, and it's something that those Latin American adults, roughly my age, have bragging rights to. So I think someday I'm going to be lecturing maybe in the Southwest, maybe Santa Fe, and find that somebody come up and say, I was one of those kids. But anyway, that was the moral compromise the U.S. government made, and so the first child teleportees were Latin American orphans, literally homeless kids. And so my dad said, so you, and I said, well, who was the next? He said, you were. Remember I took you up to Curtis Wright and we jumped and met with Dr. Agnew at the labs? And I said, oh, so that means I was the first American kid to teleport. He said, yes. So that was sort of the beginning of the involvement of kids in teleportation. At one point in we were living in the town of White Rock in New Mexico, and my dad's supervisor at several previous defense contractor companies, and literally the man who with his wife introduced my parents in a blind date and ended up walking hand in hand up the Primrose Path and got married 6 months later, Raymond Kubik, who was literally the matchmaker of my parents and my dad's supervisor, refused to teleport from Pasadena, California to New Mexico to meet with my dad. And we had a discussion how he was concerned about what the medical side effects were and so forth. And I said, well, Dad, why did you agree to do it, and why did you bring me along? You brought your son into these new dangerous and experimental activities. And my dad's position was, it was kind of twofold. It was, if human civilization is going to advance, people have to be willing to do dangerous things, to expand the envelope of human functioning in the universe, as it was. And they had to be willing to take their children with them because the children were going to be living in that future. And he said, I remember this vividly, he said, you have to remember that taking your kids with you on dangerous trips is part of the common heritage of humankind. Imagine a simple fishing village that has to swim off an island to find better fishing grounds or hunting grounds, or is escaping a volcano or something. Human beings have always put their children, even their small children, on their shoulders and gone somewhere for the betterment of the tribe. And he goes, I see no reason, son, why we shouldn't do that in modern times. There's going to be greater challenges ahead than just trying to find happier hunting grounds or escape a forest fire or a volcanic eruption or something. You kids are going to be functioning in time-space, and therefore it's my obligation to take you there. It's the ethical thing to do. And I think my father was right. But in any case, I was the first American child to teleport in 1967-68. And in those ensuing 3 years, beginning with fall of 1969, I took part in 8 different forms of time travel, several of which were new and dangerous and experimental, as I mentioned. Experimental applications of applied quantum physics, then being researched and developed. So most of the devices that I had contact with were new and dangerous. They were literally standardizing the function of them. They hadn't already been developed. They were being developed. So we were involved in essentially activities that could have injured us, that injured several children. I'll describe what happened to them, and that could have cost us our lives. And so that's why I'm not that charitable about those who say that my experiences didn't happen, because I was involved in something incredibly important at the risk of my own life. And I think I know how astronaut Buzz Aldrin feels when he landed that uppercut on the chin of Bart Sibrel, because I know from my father's own work as an American engineer who had gotten an FBI background check to work on the instrumentation in the lunar module that we landed on the moon. So I'll just throw that out. So anyway, let's have the next slide, Hesper. So today I'm leading a truth campaign to reveal to the world that time travel has been achieved by the U.S. and also that the U.S. has already used potentially a time travel device, but an advanced transportation device called a jump room to reach and colonize the planet Mars. And as in the case of time travel, it hasn't told us that. So our right to remain a self-governing people has been jeopardized by the military-industrial complex in concealing these important thresholds that we've passed. The time travel I'm going to be discussing today was all fairly operational by 1970, but again, it was new, dangerous, and experimental. I didn't invent Project Pegasus for DARPA, as some people have interpreted, but I've named my truth campaign Project Pegasus simply to own it. I mean, if they're going to put me in Project Pegasus as a kid, I'm going to take back that terminology and call my truth campaign Project Pegasus. And my overriding goal is to advantage humanity with the life advantaging benefits of teleportation and the other major process that they developed during these years, chronovision, in the 21st century and beyond. Now, I have other purposes. Regarding the past, I'm trying to fill in the true picture, the true history of the second half of the 20th century. The bottom line is this, and everybody on the planet deserves to know it, that the very Manhattan Project physicists who gave us the atomic bomb, a weapon of mass destruction, I think a very negative thing for that reason, also gave us a very beneficial set of technologies, and those are teleportation, Tesla teleportation, and other time travel devices and methodologies. In the present, as we'll see, one of the major things they did with their intelligence findings from time travel is brief future presidents of their destinies, beginning roughly with Jimmy Carter. So as a constitutionally sworn officer, having been constitutionally sworn when I took the oath of attorney in Clark County, Washington on November 15th of 1996, I believe that I'm under a professional duty and a legal one, a constitutional one, to tell the American people the truth, and that is that their selection of their presidents has been influenced by the advent of time travel technology. That's certainly an historical and social development, a political development, if you will, that the framers of the U.S. Constitution could not anticipate would have happened 200 years later, or 250 years later. I'm also speaking on behalf of the future because, as I said, I think that teleportation is going to be needed literally to not just to thrive in the 21st century, but to survive. It's going to be necessary to be implemented to achieve planetary sustainability. And regarding the cosmos in general, Mars is the planet that every 2 years comes closest to Earth. We've been there. We're developing a colony there. So it's just unconscionable that Mars has been reached by human chrononauts from the United States, but that humanity has not been told. I mean, that literally presents the first test of our cosmic citizenship as a species, is how do we relate? How do we interact favorably? How do we promote positive policies regarding the humanoid beings that exist on the planet Mars? And just look at the whole heuristic dimension of that. Even today, school children are growing up being told that we're the only inhabited planet in our solar system, but in fact our neighboring planet has been inhabited for eons just as ours has been. So I'm also speaking out for the cosmos and our role in it. So in the first part of my lecture, we're going to look at some of the people who were involved. I think this will sort of recast how time travel actually emerged, because it's people who are the catalysts for developments in society. So we're going to look at who some of those are. In the second part of my lecture, we're going to look at each of the technologies. What I can't show you visually, I will describe. In part 3, I'm going to answer the questions. It's often asked, I think that's to the credit of the people of the world. They're often asking me, why were children involved? And so I'll give the answers for that. I know what they are. On part 4, I'm going to describe some of the intelligence findings that were made using time travel, so I can reveal to you what the US government knew about the future by 1970. Now, I don't speak of time travel in this context. I speak of quantum access, because time travel implies physical relocation in the time-space continuum. But the project was just as interested in doing everything from remote viewing to chronovision to create either mental or holographic pictures of non-local events. So when we talk about time travel, we're really talking about, or gathering intelligence via time travel, we're really talking about quantum access, using advanced applications in quantum physics to either send people to a past or future event, or create a hologram or other rendering of what's going on at a distance in the time-space continuum. I think when I show this section of what the US government knew by 1970 about the future, typically the scales fall from the attendees' eyes, because they go, oh, that's why Watergate seems so intentional. I mean, like Nixon was set up. Or yeah, that may explain why Condoleezza Rice urged Mayor Willie Brown of San Francisco not to fly on September 11th, etc. So they knew a lot. And they decided to not play God, and they basically decided to use quantum access to engage in contingency planning for future events, but not stop the events. Okay, so that has ethical dimensions that have never been explored publicly, but that's in fact what happened. They've been arriving at intelligence findings about future events, sometimes intervening and giving specific individuals pre-knowledge of their role in future events, but not really actively working to change the future. And one of the reasons is that if you do that based on your initial findings, it's questionable at what you're actually looking at, for example, in the chronovisor, and you're basically vitiating the quality of your forward intelligence if you're acting in the present to try to divert it. And then there's a question that even sort of the opposite of the grandfather paradox. Can you even change the event you're seeking to change if you're looking at its fulfillment in the future? Maybe you can try, maybe you can put John O'Neill of the FBI in an apartment office in the ground floor of the World Trade Center and still have the event happen. So we're going to look at what they knew by 1970, and I think it's going to be revelatory because, as you'll see, they knew a lot. And bear in mind, they've been using quantum access for over 40 years since 1970. 1970 to 2010, now it's 2013, so for 43 years. And we're talking about the US government almost having omnipotence, if not omniscience, about future events. So, Hesper, if you can advance that slide. Then I'm going to tell you about my investigation. And if anybody leaves this lecture believing I'm making it up, thank you, because then I have a Ray Bradbury level of creativity as a writer. I'm not making this up. And I'll show you the kind of factual consistencies that I derived during my investigation that just can only indicate that what I remember really happened. And I actually did have some meetings with people from the government where they confirmed that Project Pegasus existed, that involved time travel technology, and that I was in it. And they wanted me to shut up about it. So if we could look at the next part. Then at the end, I'm going to go into the public policy choices about teleportation and chronovision, because that basically encapsulates what quantum access is. You're either teleporting somebody using some method or you're deriving a remote image of a past or future event. So I'll discuss the public policy choices, and then I'll open the floor up for questions. So if anybody at one point would like to take a break, just indicate that, and that's when we'll take our first break. So part one, the people. Is it not advancing? Okay, so I mentioned Project Pegasus was carried out under the aegis of DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. When I was enrolled, it was ARPA. So that fact doesn't present a threat to the credibility of my story. I was at a lecture at an Army base in Morristown, New Jersey, where the word ARPA was drawn on the board by the military officer who was briefing us. He was briefing 4 of us, including myself. So off and on over the years, DARPA has either been the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency or simply the Advanced Research Projects Agency, or ARPA. This is the sort of elite specialized military technology agency that brought us Star Wars and told us about it because they were trying to intimidate the former Soviet Union, that they were occupying the higher ground. And we've learned that the internet was derived by Dr. Jacques Vallée and others at UCLA as ARPANET in 1969, when in fact DARPA, or ARPA at that time, was enrolling American schoolchildren in a time travel program. ARPANET is beginning that year at UCLA. They didn't tell us that they had derived time travel technology because, look, teleportation gives the government to put personnel exactly where they want them, not just on the face of the earth, but on the face of the earth at any particular time. That is to say, that the different time travel technologies do. Teleportation is somewhat limited because you can't teleport somebody to the time before the development of the device, or they're going to be stranded in time. As I used to think about it, I might be lost in time. This was at a time when I was watching Lost in Space on, after school on television, and I was terrified that they were going to lose me in time. And then also, obviously, chronovision gave them an incredibly valuable intelligence gathering tool that the Soviet Union didn't have and other countries didn't have. So if we could advance it to the next slide. The principal defense contractor involved in Project Pegasus was my father's employer, the Ralph M. Parsons Company in New York City, which then in 1972 moved to Los Angeles, and then a few years later moved to its current location in a 6-acre corporate campus on West Walnut Street in Pasadena, California. Parsons is one of the world's 2 largest process engineering firms, along with Bechtel Company. Stephen Bechtel employed as his lieutenants during World War II Ralph M. Parsons and another person we'll be seeing shortly, which was John Alexander McCone. Like his mentor, Bechtel, Ralph M. Parsons went on and developed basically the competing engineering company for Bechtel around the world. And John Alexander McCone became the director of the Central Intelligence Agency ultimately, after going into a career in intelligence. So even in that kind of triad of individuals in American history, the very development of time travel was done under the Parsons Company, and it was developed during a period when Bechtel's other lieutenant, McCone, had just left the DCI position. So you have kind of that cross-fertilization of engineering, quantum engineering, or time travel, and intelligence work. These guys were all friends. In fact, I remember sitting in Ralph M. Parsons' office when he was still in New York, so that had to be before 1972. And he looked over at me and he said, "So, time traveling, are you, Andy?" "Good, son." It's like, he was a rather august, he was like a typical corporate executive type. And the guys in the project, including my dad, were on a first-name basis with Ralph. Now, Parsons is a remarkable company. One of the things they did is build an entire city in Saudi Arabia called Yanbu. It's a completely artificial city with all of the attributes of a port city of 100,000 inhabitants that they built from scratch out on the coastline of Saudi Arabia. So it's literally a remarkable company in that sense. One of the things I found on Parsons' website in the biography of the founder of their company, before I started speaking out publicly, was an affirmation of a description of the fact that in 1972, shortly before dying in 1974, Ralph M. Parsons bought the world's largest private yacht from the Arab billionaire Adnan Khashoggi and rechristened it Pegasus II, even though there's no evidence that Ralph M. Parsons had owned anything called Pegasus or Pegasus I. Even his childhood wagon was not called Pegasus. So right there, hiding in plain sight, on the website of arguably the first or second largest process engineering company in the world, and a leading defense contractor, a company that gave the United States government, literally constructed for the United States government, the MX missile system, where they're going to be putting nuclear warheads on this big train system around the country to hide them from being knocked out by the Soviet missiles, was an admission that Ralph M. became apparently fairly wealthy by 1972 and buys the world's largest private yacht, and for some strange reason calls it Pegasus 2. I was on the christening of that boat in Long Beach, as Pegasus 2 in Long Beach Harbor in 1972, and everybody was agile into sort of a big champagne party, and Ralph was being slapped on the back. But I think it makes sense that he would have that kind of private largesse by that point, not just because he had a huge engineering company, but because he'd given the United States government time travel over the last 3 years, and he must have been richly rewarded, just independent of his wealth from having one of the world's largest engineering companies. Now, Project Pegasus at the time that I joined it in 1969 was not primarily a time travel project. It was an intelligence program for the CIA. So by 1970, when the 8 methodologies that I'm going to describe today had been derived, Project Pegasus existed primarily to perform remote sensing in time of past and future events to aid the US government in contingency planning for future events. I even read a mimeographed DARPA paper that was entitled Remote Sensing in Time. Okay, so Project Pegasus was debriefing the teleportees and other forms of time travelers, including myself, having gone to the past and future using different methodologies and different technologies. And so we were being interviewed to derive, when we were going forward in time, like in the Montauk chair, information with which the US government could create reports that were promulgated by the CIA and then sent around the project and other areas of the government to people with a need to know status, to know certain events. Of the people I know who had that status when I was on the project, they included John Alexander McCone, former Director of Central Intelligence, Dr. Harold Agnew, who by 1970 became the director of the entire Los Alamos National Labs, and my father, who I later pieced together and actually got information from basically a CIA agent who I connected to through a college professor friend of mine, was in the CIA database and had the status of essentially being the point man between the Parsons Company and the CIA on one of the technologies, which was Tesla teleportation. So my dad was fairly highly placed. I remember walking into the La Placida restaurant in Old Town Albuquerque around 1971 with my dad and about 3 of his colleagues from Parsons, and I was sort of towards the back of the group of people walking into that famous Mexican restaurant there on the square in Old Town Albuquerque. And one of my dad's colleagues said, "La Placita, Andrew, you know what La Placita means?" And my dad turned around and actually shut him up. My dad was a polite man. He was a devout Catholic, he was a humble man. He was the middle child of 11 impoverished children of a Polish coal mining family who had been born on the kitchen table in Summit Hill, Pennsylvania on May 3rd of 1923. He used to describe eating toast and apple butter for his meal out of 2 of the 3 meals of the day during the Depression. And he didn't pull rank on people very easily. But when this guy said, it's basically CIA, as we're walking into like the most famous Mexican restaurant in all of New Mexico, he actually pull ranked and looked back and scowled and told the man to shut up. So that I think shows the fact that my dad was deeply immersed with the CIA when we were on Project Pegasus. When I went through the same connections through my friend to the guy who had been a lieutenant commander with O&I who had ties at CIA, what came back to me when I asked about my father's status with CIA, the answer was typically Strangelovian from the CIA. They said, "We cannot reveal information to the family members of living or deceased CIA personnel." So I asked them, was my dad a spook with you guys? And they say, "No, we can't answer your question because you're a living family member of a deceased CIA personnel." So he was CIA, as were many of the other people. They had reporting requirements when they were working on defense technical projects. They were sending reports to the Navy, to the Air Force, and to the CIA, because the CIA monitors our weapons development, and naturally, and from other agencies and so forth, and defense contractors. And so, in addition to time travel being captured by the military during World War II, it is also, it's true to say that it has also been captured by the Central Intelligence Agency, which I don't think has a very high reputation for proper conduct around the world. You know, assassinating foreign leaders, advising the military to invade sovereign countries, and you know, throwing elections and so forth, and also undermining the civil liberties of Americans and foreign nationals. But I'm proud of my dad, and I think you can say that he was a white hat inside the intelligence community, because among other things, he was actively urging the public adoption, you know, the declassification and deployment of Tesla teleportation for civilian functions, for civilian transport, when he was serving on this project. So I have to ask, when he had that heart attack at age 53 at his desk at Parsons, was it just because of where his health was, or was it a hit? Because my dad was somewhat of a dissident voice within Project Pegasus, and I think he was a moral arbiter in that sense, and I'm proud of him. So here's my dad in 1985, and we had a really special experience as father and son, and that's really why I just put this up here. I just want to emphasize the fact that I'm proud of my dad. I think he did the right thing by urging the declassification of Tesla teleportation, and I also think he was right regarding putting his son on his shoulders and taking him into the time-space age. And so I credit him with the incredible experiences I had in Project Pegasus. My dad, as I said, was the chief technical liaison between Parsons and the CIA on Tesla teleportation. He held a BS in electrical engineering from Lehigh University, class of 1951. He once told me when I was very young that he had gone gray from age 16. So how is it that he has this handsome dark hair here as a 28-year-old upon graduation from Lehigh? That must be a timeline issue, because here at 28, he was not gray. And I remember even as a small child saying, you know, your dad has white hair because he started going gray at 16. So he may have been dyeing his hair. But I think this is a timeline issue where I have information from different segments of time that I was on. I can explain that as we get deeper into the material. He was admitted to the Engineering Honor Society at Kappa Nu upon graduating from Lehigh. He was professionally associated his entire career with the IEEE, the International Electrical Engineering something, I don't know what it is, Emporium or Ensemble or something, which has its fingerprints all over time travel. Even when I went to the place where the jump room to Mars was in the early 80s, which was at 999 North Sepulveda Boulevard in El Segundo, California, I found that the IEEE was holding meetings there in that building, even today. So this is one of the smoking guns. When we see this, it possibly indicates that the engineer is covertly involved in advanced applications in quantum physics, including different forms of time travel. He had worked at Curtiss-Wright, where he took me to jump to New Mexico there in 1968. On projects like the ramjet engine, he actually designed the alloy by which the ramjet would not melt from friction upon moving contact with molecules of oxygen in our atmosphere and particles of space dust when the ramjet went into the near-Earth environment, basically into outer space. And that was one of the projects that was launched. My dad was actually ordered to report to Curtiss-Wright in October 1952, several months after the notorious, famous July 1952 overflight of Washington, D.C. by 9 extraterrestrial craft that had been clocked at Langley Air Force Base as traveling at 7,000 miles per hour. Okay, so my dad's life and career, shortly, he worked for about a year just designing ordinary household stuff at Okanite Company in Paramus, New Jersey. A year later, he's got his degree from Lehigh and 1 year of experience. A U.S. Army colonel shows up at his desk at Okanite in Paramus and orders him to report to Curtiss-Wright in Woodridge, New Jersey the next Monday. And I remember him telling me about that incident. He asked the officer, what for, why? And the officer didn't give him any information. He said, because your government compels it. And my dad thought, I better get up on Monday and drive over to Curtiss-Wright then. My government's going to be asking me to do something. And I think that it was because of my dad's brilliance as an engineer, as indicated by his studies at Lehigh, where he did 50% in engineering, 25% in math, and 25% in physics. And I have his papers. I've gone through them. I have a big box of rotting papers from my dad's time at Lehigh in the late 40s, early 50s. And so I think he must have been recommended by a professor or something, because all he'd done is that 1 year at Oakland. He also had worked at an elite think tank called the Thomas A. Edison Research Labs in West Orange, New Jersey, that were literally physically next door to the historical Edison labs. There was just one doorway that was always locked that divided the Edison labs that Hillary Clinton rescued as First Lady and turned into a national historical site and saved over 1 million papers of Edison and his staff as First Lady. She's never credited for that, but it was a great thing for the country. And what I'm saying is that Edison's labs were lying fallow for 50 years until Hillary Clinton saved them and made them a national historical monument. But this Edison Labs began in 1950, was next to it. It was founded by a man named Neil Williams, who my dad earned several U.S. patents in. And I did interview Neil T. Williams, and he remembered my dad vividly, and they had shared several U.S. patents together. And this is how my whole investigation went. This is literally one of my dad's colleagues from, doing this research beginning around the year 2000. So I'm going back almost 50 years in terms of my dad meeting Neil Williams, or Neil meeting my father as a colleague. And in the same roughly hour telephone interview, Neil Williams said, Andy, most of what we were doing at the Edison Labs in those years was making improvements on the old Edison storage battery. And then 10 minutes before the interview ended, he said, Andy, look, everything we were doing at the Edison Labs was classified defense work for the government. Okay, I cite that not to pick on Neil Williams. He was a great guy. He gave me a lot of information. He remembered even the patents that they had shared, just off the top of his head. He was still quite cognizant. But that's how I've been treated by everybody I've interviewed. Anybody close enough to my dad or me in Project Pegasus has given me duplicitous answers like that in every interview, except if they were, let's say, somebody like Jean Maria Rigo, who was helping me liaise to the Army and CIA. Okay, but if they were an independent person now, one of the children who was in the project with me, one of my dad's colleagues, I've gotten all kinds of duplicitous memory like that. I've had situations where I've interviewed one of my fellow children, and I got, in this one case, I got this particular child's mind all the way to ITT Defense, where an advanced time travel activity was held. And then when I called her the next Saturday, she not only didn't remember going up there to that base, to that defense contractor, but didn't remember talking about it the previous Saturday. So, I mean, I've gone to the farthest extent that any human being could do without funding to track down this story and prove it. I mean, I've done 3 major fact-finding trips to New Mexico. I've interviewed over 100 people on the phone, sometimes short interviews, sometimes long. And I know what happened. But because of the vagaries of memory and the fact that people were brainwashed when they entered these kinds of projects and when they left, I've gotten duplicitous answers like that in virtually every interview. So I don't think I can be faulted for not getting the true story. I mean, I really beat the bushes and went out there and got the story. But at the Edison Labs, my dad did something very conspicuous, which he even informed me about when I was a kid on the project, which is he repeated Nikola Tesla's teleportation experiments that Tesla had first begun during his famous stay at Colorado Springs, Colorado in 1899. After the first time I did Coast to Coast AM with George Norrie in November 2009, I received an email from a man who actually showed me with attachments that he had grown up in Montclair, New Jersey, and he described how in 1956 on the streets of Montclair he found a 1958 penny. And so I said, well, that was probably one of the pennies that my dad talked about dropping through a magnetized cylinder, repeating one of Tesla's experiments. We were actually playing bumper pool at our home in Morris Plains, getting into the 1972 summer there before we moved to Southern California. And my dad and Ray Kubik were like filling in the blanks for me when the other players were leaving the pool table, my siblings and their friends. My dad and basically his lifelong or career-long supervising engineer and friend who had introduced him to his wife and so forth, they started filling in all these technical blanks for me, and my dad started talking about how at the Edison Labs he was magnetizing cylinders like Tesla had and doing things like dropping pennies through them, dropping chalk, billiard chalks and so forth, kind of like the one that we were using for cues playing bumper pool. And here I have somebody who found one of those pennies on the streets of Montclair. So presumably sometime after 1958, and during those 8 years, certainly after 1956, my dad dropped a penny through one of those Tesla cylinders, and this young person, found it on the streets of his hometown of Montclair. And I said, well, that wouldn't be possible. If it was some kind of improper strike, we'd know about it from people who collect coins and so forth. But it was just a 1958 penny. But it was in his hands 2 years before it should have been. So presumably that was one from my dad's experiments at the Edison Labs. So that also qualified him as an American engineer who would be brought up as a technical consultant on Tesla teleportation, because he had recapitulated Tesla's experiments during his stay at the Edison Labs. I mentioned how Project Pegasus was ultimately an intelligence gathering project for the CIA, and that they were developing forward intelligence reports. I mentioned how these reports were only distributed among those with a need to know, like John Alexander McCone. I remember him being called Alec on the project. I ran into him in several project locations. He was the DCI, for example, when President John F. Kennedy was assassinated on Dallas on November 22nd of 1963. He was such a devout Catholic that his maid wrote me, after I mentioned him in several radio interviews, and said John was actually having Mass at the house. He was actually like renting a priest to come in and give Mass every day at his residence. So that my dad and McCone and others were sort of aligned with the Catholic, as distinguished from the Mormon faction within the CIA. The CIA was hiring Catholics and Mormons because they were known as a result of the sort of the rigor of their religious practice to be people who were predisposed not to talk about what they were experiencing. In other words, they were kind of maintaining an honor code. In their worldview, they were participating in the defense of the country that had defended Christianity, and they weren't going to basically violate what they had agreed to do and talk. So Mormons and Catholics were heavily sought, frequently hired by CIA. Here we have another very devout Catholic in the class of people who would have been reading, if not writing, the intelligence reports. I think it's kind of interesting that John McCone is shown there with a pencil in his hand. Definitely an intelligence report writer and reader. And I mentioned the connection to Parsons and Bechtel, and I'll talk a little bit more about John McCone when I talk about the prior knowledge of the internet. I know from three sources, very fundamental or central people on the project, that Project Pegasus, quote unquote, owed its greatest debt of gratitude to Nikola Tesla. So one of the things I'm distinguishing in my lecture is, look, we are highly intelligent, highly creative beings. Our uniquely gifted human race developed time travel for ourselves. We did use some reverse engineering from downed extraterrestrial craft. We were given some technology by the ET groups that we were in liaison with during these years, but there's no question that time travel is the accomplishment of our species in this planetary context. It wasn't all reverse engineered from aliens. Now, the three individuals who essentially wanted me to know and remember that the work of Nikola Tesla was fundamental to the development of time travel were my father, Raymond Basiago, Dr. Robert Beckwith, who had recently left GE and was on the project. He went on to found Beckwith Engineering in Key Largo, Florida. And before his death in 2009, at age 89, Bob Beckwith was interviewed twice by myself, once by the writer Alexandra Chica Bruce, who's written a book about time travel, about the Philadelphia experiment, and also once by the great independent journalist Ken Thomas of Steam Shovel Press in Missouri. And all three of us have corroborated each other's account that in those interviews, Dr. Robert Beckwith, Bob Beckwith, confirmed that the U.S. government had achieved vortal teleportation, and it was even aboard the stealth bombers and ships, Navy ships, on the oceans of the world. So Beckwith was claiming not only that levitated teleportation, as he called Tesla vortal teleportation, had been developed, but that it had already been implemented in moving our planes and our ships around the skies of this planet or on the oceans of this world virtually instantaneously. And he described how he was in a meeting with the captain of a U.S. naval vessel that was at anchor in Tampa Bay in Florida. And the captain literally showed him where he could pull a lever and set a location before pulling the lever and relocate the ship somewhere on the ocean far distant location from Tampa Bay. He also told me how, and Alexandra and Kent, how the reason that the Stealth was so expensive after, let's say, an F-14 or F-15 Phantom conventional craft would cost about $150 million, it jumped to $1 billion, which is almost a whole order of magnitude, because of the specialized materiel that had to be developed to enable the stealth bombers to teleport, literally turn on a device that would create a vortal tunnel around their forward direction of motion and have them suddenly appear in the sky somewhere. In fact, Beckwith told me that the stealth bombers that bombed Kosovo under the Clinton administration were guys who lived with their families near Edwards Air Force Base. They got up, had breakfast, entered the stealth, went up in the sky, turned on their teleportation equipment, vortal tunneled to above Kosovo, turned off their teleportation device, hit their targets in Kosovo, did a circle east across Europe, turned on their teleportation device, and had lunch with their families near Edwards. Okay, so teleportation has been operationalized. After being weaponized in the abstract, it has now been operationalized as a weapon. And that's another reason I'm speaking out. I believe that teleportation should be a transportation modality to help the public thrive, not a weapon of war. So the Tesla connection is critical to the derivation of time travel. Was he an alien? I don't think he looks like an extraterrestrial. He looks like a servo-creation to me. Or just, a guy with a mustache. I mean, he's one of us, right? Homo sapiens sapiens. Okay, next slide, please. This is another important figure in the development of time travel. This is Father Pellegrino Ernetti of the Order of St. Benedict. All of the children that I was with in Morris Plains, New Jersey, all 10 of us, were going to Sunday school at the local Benedictine parish. The Benedictines, of course, are the famous Black Friars. Some of you conspiracy aficionados will remember the controversy involving the Vatican Bank, involving the hanging at Blackfriars Bridge in London, and the involvement of the Benedictines in that Vatican Bank scandal. Well, if some of them are developing time travel devices for the U.S., or at least passing their findings along, at some point they have to be paid, right? And the Vatican is, like the Queen of England, owns 25% of the land, the real estate of the world. And so, I'm getting off track, but in any case, Father Ernetti was doing some research with another Benedictine priest, a priest by the name of Agostino Gemelli, the priest for whom the second largest, I'm going to defer to you, isn't that the second largest hospital in Rome, I think? The Gemelli Hospital, where Pope John Paul II was convalescing before his death?
Yes, correct.
And that's a Vatican hospital, and it's the second hospital, it's the largest hospital in all of Rome, was named for his research partner, Agostino, also called Pier Maria Gemelli. I believe that would be probably his clerical name, being named for Peter and Mary, and not the sort of commoner's name of Agostino. So these two Vatican priests were doing research at the Catholic University of Milan in northern Italy in the 1940s. They were studying the harmonic patterns in Gregorian chants because they wanted to know why Gregorian chants have specialized properties, like the ability to heal people physically, to center people spiritually, to cause people to go into trance states, and so forth. And they were making a little improvement or a little change in a small microphone. And suddenly something that his partner Gemelli's, I still don't have a picture of Father Gemelli, but something that Father Gemelli's father had said to him in childhood came through the microphone. He heard his father's voice calling him in Italian. I don't know what it is. It's my little zucchini. Is zucchini the Italian word?
Zucchini, yes.
Yeah, so that's the Italian name for that vegetable. But that was his name for his little, zucchini of a little sprite, his young son. And so they're standing there, and then Ernetti said to Gemelli, "What was that?" He says, "It was my father. He was calling me his little zucchini." And so they realized they had developed essentially a window to the past. They had found a way to capture the residual sound signal of a past event. One apparently adhering some way to Father Gemelli, his aura or whatever, or in his mind, triggering maybe a memory or something like that. And they ultimately partnered with the world's leading physicist of that era, the great Enrico Fermi, who did research in Italy, then also at the University of Chicago during the war. And they developed, by 1952, a flat screen, basically something like in the nature of a television screen, in which a past event was being shown. Ernetti rather used it to prove and to derive and show the world a missing stanza, historically missing stanza from a Roman play. And he also insisted until his death in 1994, as a very respected Catholic prelate, that they had also captured images of the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth. Now I know he was telling the truth because I saw a 20 to 30 minute 16 millimeter film of the crucifixion of Jesus that was being played, that was being displayed at the Sandia National Labs in Sandia, New Mexico in the summer of 1972. Now, when we left that viewing, my dad was with his longtime friend Connie Chavez, a woman at one point that he wanted to marry, and she was just in distress watching the crucifixion of Jesus as it really happened. Jesus was an historical personage, he was crucified, and everybody in that room knew it because it wasn't a dramatized rendering of the crucifixion. It was horrendously awful to watch in light of Jesus' suffering. And we could tell, based on our understanding of the 3 New Testament accounts of the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth, that it was a real event and not just some purported event. I mean, you have David Icke claiming that the Bible was scripted by the Piso family of Rome. You have people now in Eastern religions who have come out and tried to show that Jesus is just a recapitulation of a previous deity. My position is that what we were watching was a real crucifixion. Do I know it was Jesus? Well, 600 Caucasian men, roughly his age, were crucified by the Roman Empire within 3 years of his alleged death. It could have been somebody else, but everything that the New Testament depicts about the execution of Jesus of Nazareth was in that film. We saw women coming to pray beneath his cross. There were 2 other crucifixion victims behind him on hillsides. He had a crown of thorns that was almost like a motorcycle helmet in size around his head, and blood was pouring down his temples and into his eye sockets and then down his cheeks and into his corner of his mouth. He was very emaciated. He was about my height, which used to be 5'10", and looks like many of the medieval paintings of Jesus. The women were chased away by a Roman centurion. I saw Longinus, one of those centurions, jump up on his left, with his right leg and standing on his left leg, and extend his arm as far as he could, holding the end of a spear shaft, piercing Jesus in the side. That was a so-called spear of destiny, being used to release the fluids that had gathered in Jesus' chest cavity. The sky grew dark at one point. So we knew it wasn't a dramatization. If it was somebody besides Jesus, how did so many of the details correspond to the New Testament accounts? There are 3 of them of his execution. The really incredible thing is not just seeing that, and as a Catholic Sunday school child being absolutely horrified by seeing the actual crucifixion of Jesus. Connie was just sort of squirming in her chair and not even most of the time able to look at the screen. At one point she actually put her hands and then looked a little bit past some of her fingers at what we were watching, which was horrific. I actually felt like evil was present in the room, like it was buzzing in the center of the room, like a hive of bumblebees or something. We get outside, and my dad says to Connie, I don't know why you're acting like that. And she said, what do you mean, Ray? They were crucifying my Lord. How was I supposed to respond? Connie Chavez was so devout that she spent her whole life helping the nuns at the San Felipe de Nero church there, that church that goes back to 1706, on the main square there in Old Town Albuquerque. It's actually older than the surrounding buildings, that church. But she was always doing things for the nuns. She was a devout believer. When they had my book and she learned she was going to die at age 53 of complications from diabetes, just 10 years in the future, she just expressed this almost visceral gasp as we were leaving a Chinese restaurant. Because my dad was showing her the year rather, and the condition under which she was going to die after double amputations of her legs from diabetes. And she just gasped with shock that she only had 10 years to live, and said, "Well, Ray, my faith is in Jesus Christ," and walked out of that restaurant. And that was a very vivid moment, and it really shows the measure of Connie Chavez's faith. But so my dad's saying something that's really preposterous. He's saying, "I don't know why you were acting like that." She said, "Ray, I mean, they were crucifying my Lord." And he said, "But don't worry." She said, "Why not?" He said, "Because my team also went to where Jesus was lying in the crypt, and we have the footage where 3 days later there's a flash of light in the crypt, 2 men appear." He didn't say angels. 2 men appear. Jesus stands up, and the 3 of them push the rock away, and he walks out of his crypt. Okay, so and Connie and I were obviously very astonished. And she said, "What are you saying, Ray?" And he said, "We also have footage of the resurrection." Now, I don't say that as a former Catholic to advocate Catholicism or any religion. I'm just reporting what happened. What happened is my father stated they had footage of the resurrection. Now, imagine the situation the U.S. government was in. Under our First Amendment, that guarantees freedom of religion, speech, assembly, redress, and so forth. Under the religion clause, the United States government is forbidden from prohibiting the free exercise of religion or from establishing a religion. Now, if they were to show that footage on 60 Minutes, would they be establishing a religion? Yeah. If they also technically proved some of the major tenets of Christianity, would they be prohibiting other religions? Yeah. So I think what happened on the think tank level, because they have footage of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, is that they have decided not to show it, not to admit they even have it. What would the Vatican representatives on that committee of think tank personnel be telling them? I think the Vatican priests probably would have concluded, we don't want people to accept their faith based on going to the movies, right, to seeing a documentary film, but rather to let people find Jesus authentically. I think representatives of some of the other religions that might have been brought into that think tank process, I'm assuming it happened because they had very sensitive evidence of something very profound. They must have spun it out to the Brookings Institution or whatever. I think the others might have said, well, that doesn't mean that Buddhism, my religion, isn't valid, what have you. So my position is that the United States government, the creation of the United States of America, was supposed to be the fulfillment of the Enlightenment. And so my position is they should show that footage, because if in fact it is the footage of Jesus being crucified and in the first footage, and then of Jesus resurrecting in the second, then it happened, and because it happened, it should be released as a fact of nature, so to speak. In other words, I don't see how we can turn our back on the Enlightenment and have positive evidence of a supernatural event and not show it, right? I mean, that's the most cutting-edge science you can collect, right, or perform. So my position on this is I'm going to keep on talking about it, not to advocate Catholicism or Christianity, but simply to say the U.S. government has this, and they should release it because it happened, apparently, as shown by the footage itself, both the crucifixion and the resurrection. So Ernetti stuck by that account, his whole life, and he was very respected. So there you have a prominent Vatican prelate affirming that they had footage of, in his case, that he was stating crucifixion. That also might have been a controlled release of information, but that might have been limited data right there from Father Ernetti. But he is a major figure because what they then did when they accidentally discovered chronovision, they joined with Fermi and they spun it out first into two-dimensional chronovision like television, and then when I was brought in the project, Bell Labs had already modeled chronovision as third-dimensional holograms, basically moving fields of light. But then when I was serving on the project, the chronovision evolved into fourth-dimensional chronovision, where when we would stand on the stage and the hologram would be brought down around us, we would literally go there physically and be stuck in that past event until we were basically rescued via a portal. So chronovision went from being basically TV screen-like in 1952 to literally being a time travel technology by 1972, when the Vatican lent it to the United States government. When my dad sat me down in high school and told me that I was going to the Naval Academy, which I ultimately rejected as an option. He explained that the Vatican will task different world governments to complete certain technical projects for it, and the one that we were on resulted partly from the Vatican developers of chronovision passing the chronovision technology onto the United States so it could be developed more rapidly. Next slide, please. I mentioned Agnew and that first trip meeting him. He would ultimately go on to be director in 1970 and served throughout almost the entire 70s as the director of the Los Alamos National Labs, openly or publicly and secretly as the federal science administrator of Project Pegasus. Agnew had been present at all three critical stages of the Manhattan Project. He was one of the graduate students at Chicago who was manipulating the graphite rods to prevent CP1, the atomic pile, from blowing up after going critical there in the squash courts at the University of Chicago. He was in Los Alamos and Alamogordo when the atomic bomb was designed, manufactured, and then tested at Trinity site. And he calibrated the blast of the Hiroshima bombing when riding in a chase plane called the Great Artiste that was following the Enola Gay, which was the name of the plane where pilot Paul Tillett dropped the bomb on Hiroshima. So Agnew was one of the quintessential Manhattan or fundamental Manhattan Project physicists, as I was describing here, and we were in multiple meals with Harold, lunches, dinners. I remember every time I'd pass him in a hallway at one of the atomic labs, he'd always poke me in the belly button. I remember at one lunch at a chicken country restaurant in White Rock, New Mexico, that after one of my brothers teleported with us, but was somewhat mentally reacted to the process of teleporting and was really not that cognizant of who he was or where we were. I remember Harold saying, now that we've tried it with two brothers, we can test for genetic effects. Okay, so these people were working with human subjects before the human subject protocols of 1975-76. So they knew what they were doing, and yet ultimately I think they made the right decision because we're still here. We haven't been invaded by a Soviet army jumping through vortal tunnels in time-space. Next slide, please. I mentioned Fermi. I think Fermi is probably the central figure in the hidden history of time travel because he partnered with Ernetti and Gemelli on the improvement, the development of the chronovisor, this holographic looking glass technology to see and then ultimately send people to the past or future. And he was the mentor of Harold Agnew, the federal science director, and sort of the overseer of the teleportation stuff centered in New Mexico when we were on Project Pegasus. So Fermi apparently has this covert connection to both the derivation of teleportation and chronovision. I don't believe that role belongs to Einstein, von Neumann, or others. I think it rests on the shoulders of Enrico Fermi. Curiously, we know he consulted Ernetti and Gemelli on chronovision, which means that the past persists. But the official account of his beliefs is that Fermi didn't believe that the past existed. In other words, a child fires a gun, a cap gun. Well, you can tunnel in and see the little rivulets, under chaos theory, some of the exploded gunpowder spins off, and then you see another little turtle. There's Mandelbrot functions where under chaos theory an event happens and the little parts of it start cascading forever into ultimate almost nothingness. Okay, so publicly it's claimed that Enrico Fermi believed that was the nature of the past. The past was just the new present, where the manifestations of a past event could still be detected, but where you couldn't go back and recapture or visit the original event as it had originally happened. Okay, that has to be part of the time travel cover-up because we know that he was working with Ernetti and Gemelli. And what does a chronovized event or experience to the past involve? It doesn't go back and put you where you're examining what happened when the kid shot the gun. It takes you back in time to the kid shooting the gun. So the past has to exist. We have to live in a time-space continuum for the chronovisor probes that I was on to even have been possible. And Fermi definitely believed that the past still exists. So somewhere in the complex formulae behind him on the chalkboard is ultimately a formula that squares the circle and completes the fact that the past, present, and future exist simultaneously, and you can visit both simply by going there. Okay, so again, people have said Einstein was the critical figure. Well, the only place where Einstein appears in the time travel literature is that he consulted the Navy Board of Ordnance he was consulted by the Navy Board of Ordnance in 1943, a couple months after Tesla's death. Okay, so they wanted Einstein's opinion apparently on Tesla's work, but he doesn't show up anywhere else, and obviously he was dead by 1955. On the other hand, I saw Father Anetti at the chronovisor location in Morristown, New Jersey, when he was a special guest of the project. So I'm confident I've identified some of the right people. Next slide, please. Another individual who, when I met him on Project Pegasus, was a 39-year-old former congressman from the suburbs of Chicago, was somebody who would go on and, under Presidents Gerald Ford and George W. Bush, become cumulatively the longest-serving U.S. Defense Secretary, and that is the point man on 9/11 and the response to 9/11. In fact, the individual who did a press conference on September 10th of 2001 and reported that $2.3 trillion of Pentagon funding was missing, and that a Navy investigative crew that was working right where that explosion occurred in the Pentagon was investigating the loss of that $2.3 trillion of Defense Department Pentagon funding, was the point man, the so-called defense attaché, operating between the project people like my father in New Mexico mostly, and the Department of Defense for Project Pegasus. I had numerous contacts with Donald Rumsfeld when he was defense attaché to the project. I was drinking a grape Nehi, for example, when he was having his martini. He was a drinker then. And he said to my father one time, "As long as I have my martini, I'm fine." So my dad had ordered his Jack Daniels. But we were in a bar, and later Secretary Rumsfeld was explaining to my father, he literally said, quote unquote, what we plan to do with the kids is in high school, we're going to admit them to the Naval Academy as first-year plebes, when they graduate from high school, and we'll use that as a pretext for involving them in future project activities. So there in 1970, 71, 72, they were already planning for what our destiny was going to be in the fall of 1979, and Rumsfeld was aware of what the major plan was. So I would run into him socially. I was hanging out with my dad when he was going into bars. I don't see that being that exceptional. If you and your son are 2,005 miles away from home, is it really that exceptional to bring your dad into, bring your son rather, into like a bar in a restaurant and get a drink while your son's being served a soda? I mean, I don't think that's, some people have claimed that that's a threat to the validity of my story. Going into a bar with my own father? I don't really see that as being something that was forbidden in the early 70s. But so I run into Rumsfeld particularly at, I remember there was a reception at the Hilton Hotel in Albuquerque, and he's the first person I've ever seen in public get down and do a one-arm push-up a la Jack Palance at the Oscar ceremony. But one of the important crossing of paths with Rumsfeld was in spring of 1971, we teleported to New Mexico, and then we were driven by a set of private automobiles over to the community center in Cerrillos, New Mexico, and he gave about a 20-minute, what he called a meet and greet, where he thanked us for our service in the project, told us that our parents were proud of us and our government was grateful, but that everything in the project had to remain secret. And I remember during that lecture he stated that, quote unquote, the significance of teleportation is primarily military. It will allow us to put our troops, to allow the U.S. Army to put its troops precisely where they're needed on the battlefield. Here again, the theme of sequestering time travel technology, weaponizing it, and keeping it sequestered within the inner sanctum of the military-industrial complex. I would even say, except for Parsons' involvement, basically the military complex. He described how they found in their studies of World War II that during the war, most of our combat fatalities and casualties were in the middle areas between the front lines and the rear areas. People in the rear areas were far enough from the front lines not to be shot even with shelling, and were never shot from behind because they were in the rear areas. People on the front line who knew they could be shot at even by a sniper, not a combatant immediately in front of them, knew that they were in danger and often were keeping proper cover from being shot. And also, the Nazi army wasn't shelling our frontline soldiers, it was sniping at them. They were sending missiles, shells, beyond the front lines into the middle grounds where troops were coming up, so that front line would remain thin, and also taking out things like our own cannons in the rear areas that were shooting forward from a great distance, from positions where the cannon, the soldiers maintaining cannons and that type of thing could not be hit, or at least with bullets. So, but they found that the men moving up to the front lines in the middle areas were being shot from behind by friendly fire, were being sniped at successfully by the Nazi or Japanese, infantry, and were just dying through things like, falling into a mud, into a wet area in a marsh with 80 pounds on their back. Okay, so what they wanted to do was take that danger out of deploying troops by literally putting troops precisely on the front line. Okay, if Muslim extremists suddenly rallied in Jerusalem to seize control of the Dome of the Rock, 20,000 Marines from Camp Lejeune in North Carolina could teleport there and just show up right in front of them and prevent, some kind of religious cataclysm in Jerusalem, state of emergency. So they had militarized teleportation during World War II for that purpose, basically to put troops precisely at the critical location that they needed to be placed without being killed getting there. The problem with that is none of us have been teleporting for the last 40 years. I mean, think of what was going on in 1970. The example that I use is that Vice President Al Gore was going to Harvard College and attending Dr. Roger Revelle's not global warming, it would have been then called his greenhouse effect seminar. Okay, we didn't have climate change, we didn't have global warming. When I was teleporting and Rumsfeld was envisioning putting the kids in the project into Annapolis at the end of the decade in '79, but in 1970, when we were basically had operationalized teleportation and these other devices I'm going to be discussing, Gore is studying the greenhouse effect at Harvard, not knowing, even after becoming 8 years a congressman, 8 years a senator, and 8 years vice president of the United States, apparently not being let in on the teleportation secret. And that's significant in terms of climate change because 60% of greenhouse gases come from one area of society, and that is transportation. So I'm emphasizing the fact that if we could implement Tesla teleportation, we could solve 60% of the global warming problem, at least the human contribution to it. So that's the degree to which we've been disserved by secrecy in government. I've analogized between slavery during the era of slavery and secrecy, the physical oppression of slavery being comparable in many ways to the metaphysical oppression of secrecy, and the abolition movement as the truth movement of its day being analogous to the truth movement. We're really trying to liberate this information from state secrecy so that the metaphysical oppression that's over us, even the change in our attitudes when we have to spend 2 hours on a freeway to get to our job or school or doctor or whatever, has to end. It's the abolition cause of our era is confronting our government to come clean with the truth so that we can use the truth to save us, to set us free. And that's what I'm trying to do. So anyway, Rumsfeld was on the project, and he was clearly devoted to the notion that teleportation should remain a military secret. Another person who was on the project when we were teleporting in mass in summer of '70 as a group of school children, we would be greeted by Jack Pruitt. I don't have a picture of Pruitt, I know Alexander Bruce does, but I haven't been able to retrieve a photo of Jack Pruitt. But Jack Pruitt would do the head count, and then a young 24, 25-year-old Bill Richardson would take us into the Bataan Memorial Building, which was the pre-1966 state capitol, and sit us down in one of those little chairs with a desk on it, and ask us our name first and last, ask us to spell our last name, and then give our date of birth. And so when he brought me in one time, he said, first name? I said, Andrew. He said, and your last name, Andrew? Basiago. Could you spell that? That sounds kind of unusual. I said, B-A-S-I-A-G-O. He said, well, that sounds like Basiago. You pronounce it, what is it? And I said, Basiago. And he said, Italian? He said, no, Polish. He said, well, thank you very much, Andrew. And your date of birth? 9/18/61. Okay, thanks a lot, Andy. If you tell the next child to step in, okay? He was very, formal, businesslike. But on one of those questionings, a subsequent one, after he finished questioning, I looked up at him and said, first name? And he kind of leaned forward and said, Bill. And I said, and your last name, Bill? And he said, Richardson. And could you spell that for me, Bill Richardson? And then I asked him his date of birth was sometime in 1945. So anyway, Richardson was basically one of the young staffers on the project. He had no leadership responsibility. It was just completing tasks for the project, like taking that head count when we would arrive via teleportation in the Santa Fe State Capitol grounds. To his credit, before Jesse Ventura interviewed me on camera, Bill Richardson was the only member of the project and the only public official, somebody who went on to a career in public service, who met with me. And that took place around June 10th of 2003 at the Old Car Show in Chama, New Mexico. So I always laud Bill Richardson for at least meeting with me and acknowledging that the project existed and I was in it, and that had he been in my situation, he would be doing exactly what I was doing, basically investigating the project, planning to write about it, to speak about it, and so forth. But he said, you have to understand, I'm a public official, and if I call a press conference with you in Santa Fe, my career is over. I mean, saying that, he said, I think the analogy here is to the Roswell incident. I know that aliens crashed at Roswell, New Mexico in 1947 because I'm a public official in the state of New Mexico. You know that happened because you were in Project Pegasus, and that was in fact in your curriculum. And he was right. It was in the yellow book classes that would be taught to prepare us for involvement in the project. He said, but if I meet with you publicly over this and declare that I was a young staffer on a time travel project, it's not going to pass the giggle test. I'm basically going to be drummed out of office ultimately for something seemingly so silly. And I think he was probably right. He said, you have to understand, it's your life purpose and your mission to declassify this project. And I want you to know that behind the scenes I support you. But based on my life plan and being optimally effective myself, I can't go public for you. I wish I could. And he apologized. And I think that was pretty big of Bill Richardson. I was really pretty impressed by what he had to say up at the Old Car Show in Chama. And we actually were directed there. I had been directed into a number of meetings with informants in the summer of 2003, or June of 2003. So Richardson goes on, and what does he become? The representative in the House of Representatives from the 3rd District of New Mexico, where all the atomic labs are, Energy Secretary under Clinton, UN representative, and then later governor of New Mexico. So he really stayed there and completed a public career doing things for the atomic labs, Lanel, Sandia, etc. But nonetheless, he showed some humanity, I think, by meeting with me and explaining his situation. Another person who was critical on the project but who was denied his involvement, even avoiding me, now this sounds intrusive, but I did have permission to enter, even when I was sitting at his kitchen table in Los Alamos with his wife of 50 years, Sterling Colgate, who was called Stir during those days, I shouldn't know that, right? Refused to come home to his house and meet with me at his kitchen table. Now, Sterling Colgate, when I was on the project, was both alternatively the dean of physics, the physics department, the director, the chairman of the physics department, and the president of the New Mexico Institute of Science and Technology, or New Mexico Tech, in Socorro, New Mexico. He was as I'll explain later, he was the time scientist who sent me from a plasma confinement chamber in East Hanover, New Jersey, in 1972, to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania on November 19th of 1863 to try to see Lincoln give the Gettysburg Address. And he was also one of the heirs to the Colgate-Palmolive dynasty. And when I did my recent return to my hometown of Morris Plains and Morristown, New Jersey, and went over to East Hanover, I realized that Menem, the pharmaceutical company, changed its name from Colgate-Palmolive in 1972, right as we were leaving for California, and after Sterling Colgate had developed a form of physical time travel by 1972 called plasma confinement. Isn't that interesting that the company would change its name? So my dad explained that Colgate-Palmolive was literally secretly funding Project Pegasus on behalf of the defense technical community, because as we saw in Iran-Contra, if you can create an independent funding apparatus, you're not constitutionally obliged to have Congress have oversight authority over what you're doing. So Sterling Colgate is now ill. He may be dying, and after multiple attempts, I've been unable to interview him, but I'm absolutely certain that he was the developer of plasma confinement for reasons I'll describe later in my talk. Another person who's denied involvement in both working with me in the Montauk chair in Project Pegasus and being our Mars training officer 10 years later in the CIA's Mars Jump Ring program is the venerable Major Ed Ames of remote viewing fame. I'm not going to avoid the issue especially after Bernard Mendez and William Stillings, two of my fellow jumpers, have corroborated the fact that Dames was our instructor in summer of 1980 at College of the Siskiyous in Weed, California. I think he's been propagating what I call, and is the architect of the high-sci disinformation ploy, which always talks about all of the advances in remote viewing in the 1970s and 80s, but never talks about time travel. I mean, here I was working with him in time travel, and he's done, what, 40 appearances on Coast to Coast AM, talking about the kill shot from the sun, and missing person cases, and the whole remote viewing thing, but never acknowledged that he was involved in far deeper U.S. defense projects. He even gave conventional remote viewing the term technical remote viewing, but what's a technical remote viewer? A device. It's a chronovisor, right? If you're going to be augmenting the ability of the human mind to see things at a distance with some kind of hologram-based propagator of either the image itself or some focalizing of the mind's ability to see things at a distance in time-space, in the past, in the future, in time, but also just spatially, just at a distance on the face of the Earth, you're going to need chronovision, or you're going to have to augment. If it's technical remote viewing, it's going to involve the augmentation of psi. But Ed gave that term to conventional remote viewing, hence the propagation of a cover story that would always omit the use of time travel technologies to enhance human psychic performance. So I don't want to call him a liar, but let's just say he hasn't come forward. Okay, part two, the technologies themselves.
Could we take a break?
Yeah, would you like to take a break there? We're going into the technologies. Yeah. Yeah. Just take 5 maybe, or?
Yeah.
Yeah.